Bullets rip through palm fronds in the sweltering Guadalcanal jungle. A squad of Marines huddles desperately behind a fallen tree, pinned down by a Japanese machine gun nest. 2 miles back, their commander receives their distress call. The Japanese knew exactly where to find his men. Another American code broken. The commander glances at the 2 nervous new arrivals assigned to his communications team. Young, barely out of training, they stand awkwardly apart from the other Marines. Yet he's been told they have something special, something different, something unbreakable. Though skeptical, he gives them the message to pass on to the Fire Direction Center. Enemy machine gun nest on your right. Destroy. The commander watches in suspense as one of the Marines pulls the radio close, wondering what he could possibly do that they haven't already tried. Suddenly, a Marine's mouth starts moving. What is said is completely unlike anything the commander has ever heard before. The man with the idea. February 1942. Less than 3 months since the United States entered World War II, in Los Angeles, civil engineer and World War I veteran Philip Johnston sat reading the morning newspaper. His brow furrowed with concern as he read the stories of the seemingly unstoppable Japanese rampage across the Pacific, and the plight of General MacArthur's troops in the Philippines as they desperately tried to stop it. If only there was something he could do to help, he thought. Turning the page, he found an article that piqued his interest. It explained how the U.S. Army had been experimenting with Native American languages during training maneuvers in Louisiana. In the weeks since the U.S. had entered the war, the Japanese had proven alarmingly adept at breaking American codes. Military communications that should have remained secret were being intercepted and deciphered with devastating effectiveness, putting the fate of the entire Pacific region at risk. The problem was that coded communications sent in English or other commonly spoken languages often proved decipherable by enemy forces who had people who had studied those languages among their population. Yet Native American languages were thought to be significantly more difficult for foreign armies to translate due to the limited availability of people who could speak them. The use of Native American languages for U.S. military communications was nothing new. During World War I, the Choctaw language had been used with great success. In particular, coded messages sent by Choctaw troops of the U.S. Army 36th Infantry Division played a crucial role in several battles of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive of October 1918. Nevertheless, it was believed that both Germany and Japan had subsequently sent students to the United States to study Native American languages like Cherokee, Choctaw, and Comanche. Now that the Axis powers had their own speakers of these languages, it would be much easier for any code sent in them to be broken. While they were still used to some extent in World War II, many military officials were increasingly doubtful about sending coded messages in Native American languages, believing they would no longer prove effective. Instead, the Allies now tended to rely on mechanical encoding devices. However, the complicated encryption and decryption processes tended to be extremely time-consuming, and their numerical codes were still frequently broken. Yet, as Johnston read the article, he suddenly realized that he might have something that could be of use to the war effort: the Navajo language. Unlike other Native American languages, Navajo remained largely unwritten. Its complex syntax, unique tonal qualities, and numerous dialects made it virtually unintelligible to anyone without extensive exposure and specialized training. It was even unintelligible to native speakers of its closest relatives in the Na-Dene language family. By some estimates, fewer than 30 non-Navajo people in the world could understand the language at that time. Fortunately, one of those people was Johnston. As the son of missionaries, he had spent his childhood living among the Navajo people, immersed in their culture and becoming one of the few outsiders fluent in their complex language. At just 9 years old, he went to Washington, D.C. as an interpreter for a Navajo delegation advocating for tribal rights. Determined to put those skills to good use, Johnston approached the United States Marine Corps. He requested a meeting with Major General Clayton B. Vogel, Commanding General of the Amphibious Corps Pacific Fleet. It took persistence to convince skeptical military officials to consider his proposition. When he finally secured an audience with Major James E. Jones at Camp Elliott, Johnston spoke a few phrases in Navajo. The bewildered expression on the Major's face told him everything he needed to know. This could work. Demonstrating the plan. Johnston quickly assembled 4 Navajo men from the Los Angeles area, along with another who was already serving in the Navy in San Diego. He arranged a demonstration for February 28, 1942, to prove the potential of his concept. Before the demonstration, Johnston prepared a detailed report for Major General Vogel, explaining the unique characteristics of the Navajo language and its speakers. He emphasized the language's complexity and the isolation of the Navajo reservation, a vast 25,000 square mile territory spanning parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. This geographic seclusion had preserved the linguistic purity that now made it so valuable. The demonstration would prove to be a turning point in military communication strategy. Marine officers composed simulated battlefield messages and handed them to a Navajo translator, who converted them into his native language and transmitted them to another Navajo at the receiving end. The second man then translated the message back into perfect English, matching the original text precisely. What normally took 30 minutes using conventional coding machines was accomplished in just 20 seconds. 1 week after this impressive display, on March 6, 1942, General Vogel sent a letter to the Marine Corps Commandant. He recommended the immediate recruitment of 200 Navajo men for a new classified communications program. In his correspondence, Vogel noted that the Navajo dialect was completely unintelligible to all other tribes, and that the Navajo were the only tribe not yet infiltrated by German or Japanese agents posing as students, art dealers, or anthropologists. Not everyone was convinced. Some officers questioned whether the supposed advantage of speed would actually matter in combat scenarios. Others worried about field commanders relying on messages they themselves couldn't understand. Despite these objections, the program received initial approval, though on a smaller scale than Johnston had envisioned. Rather than the 200 Navajos that Vogel requested, the Marine Corps decided to start with a pilot project of 30 Navajos. Johnston himself was permitted to enlist so he could participate in developing the program. The first 29. With the Commandant's approval, the first group of Navajo men was sought out for this highly classified mission. Not only would recruits need to demonstrate fluency in both English and Navajo, they would also meet standard enlistment qualifications and undergo the same basic training as other Marines. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo men, one of the initial 30 dropped out, were sworn into service at Fort Wingate, a former Army fort that had been converted into a Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school. This first group would become known as the First 29 and would form Platoon 382, the Marine Corps' first all-Indian, all-Navajo unit. They came from communities across the vast Navajo territory, places like Chinle, Tohatchi, Shiprock, and Toadlina. Carl Gorman, at just 35 years old, was the eldest recruit when he joined, while William Dean Yazzie, also known as William Dean Wilson, was the youngest at only 16. These men traveled from their remote homeland to San Diego, where they experienced Marine Corps boot camp alongside other recruits. For many, it was their first time away from the reservation. Yet upon arrival, the disciplined environment wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Many had attended government-established or religious boarding schools, where strict regimens and English language instructions had been mandatory. As Chester Nez, one of the original 29, later recalled, quote, "Boot camp wasn't too hard for us Navajos, because we were used to rough treatment, marching, and getting yelled at in boarding school." After completing basic training at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, the Navajo recruits moved to the Field Signal Battalion Training Center at Camp Pendleton. There, they learned the fundamentals of military communications, radio operation, standard procedures, and equipment maintenance. Next, they would face their biggest challenge yet, developing a code that could outsmart the most skilled Japanese cryptographers. Creating the code. Working in absolute secrecy at Camp Elliott, the initial recruits worked alongside Marine communications personnel to design the first Navajo code. The task was far from simple. The Navajo language, while rich and expressive, lacked words for modern military terminology. How could they describe tanks, airplanes, or artillery using centuries-old vocabulary designed for a traditional way of life in the deserts of the American Southwest? Their solution was ingenious. They developed a two-part system that made the code virtually impenetrable to anyone unfamiliar with both the Navajo language and the specific military adaptations they created. The first part of the system, known as Type 1 code, consisted of a Navajo alphabet. The code talkers selected Navajo words to represent each letter of the English alphabet. The words chosen typically began with the sound of the English letter they represented. For instance, Wolachi, the Navajo word for ant, represented the letter A. Shush, meaning bear, stood for B. Mawasi, or cat, represented C. For letters that appeared frequently in English messages, multiple Navajo words were assigned to prevent patterns that might be detected by enemy codebreakers. The letter A could also be represented by Belasana, apple, or Tsenihi, axe. This variation further complicated any attempt to decipher the messages. The second component, Type 2 code, directly translated English words into Navajo. This approach was used for common military terms that would be frequently transmitted. However, for specialized military terminology with no Navajo equivalent, they created new meanings for existing Navajo words based on imagery and metaphor. The Navajo word for turtle, Chai-Dagahi, became the code word for tank because of the similar protective shells. Dive bomber was designated Guinea, which means chicken hawk in Navajo, a bird known for its diving attacks. The submarine became Beshlo, meaning iron fish, while buzzard, Jaysho, represented a bomber aircraft. In all, the first iteration of the code included 211 vocabulary terms specifically adapted for military communications. This vocabulary would later expand to 411 terms as the code evolved throughout the war. For words not included in their specialized dictionary, the code talkers would spell them out letter by letter using their Type 1 alphabetic code. This combination of methods made the Navajo code extraordinarily secure and flexible. What made the system particularly powerful was that it was not a direct substitution cipher that could be broken with frequency analysis. Even fluent Navajo speakers who weren't trained in the specific military adaptations would hear only disconnected, seemingly random words without understanding the true message. As the code was developed, each man committed it entirely to memory. No written records were permitted in combat situations to prevent the code from falling into enemy hands. They trained intensively, practicing until they could send and receive messages efficiently under the most adverse conditions: simulated artillery fire, aircraft noise, and physical exhaustion. Being able to instantly recall hundreds of code words under the stress of combat would require exceptional mental discipline. A skeptical lieutenant decided to test the code talkers before trusting them with actual combat communications. He was astonished when they successfully translated, transmitted, and retranslated a test message in 2.5 minutes, a process that would normally take hours without the Navajo code. Deployment begins. By November 1942, the first Navajo code talkers were deployed to the Pacific. They were to operate at various levels of command, from battalions and regiments to divisions. The code talkers were typically assigned in pairs to a military unit, one to operate the portable radio, and the other to send and receive messages in Navajo, translating them to English for their commanders. To avoid revealing the name of the language used in these transmissions, they were typically referred to within the Marine Corps as Arizona or New Mexico messages. Chester Nez was part of a small group of code talkers sent to join up with the 1st Marine Division in Guadalcanal, where the United States had been locked in a bitter and bloody struggle with Japanese forces for the past 3 months. He would later recall, quote, "When we first hit the beach, it was kind of something that you think about what's going to happen. How far are you going to go into the jungle? What's waiting for you up ahead? What's going to happen? Are you going to be hit, or are you going to be lucky?" His first transmission using the Navajo code led to a successful artillery strike on a Japanese machine gun position, filling him with pride and helping to put to rest any doubts his superiors and comrades may have held about the effectiveness of this method. Fellow code talker Roy Hawthorne later explained its massive impact, saying, quote, "When the code talker program was established, it turned the whole thing around. The Japanese could not decode our messages, and as a result, they weren't winning the battles like they had been winning the battles." By February 1943, U.S. forces had succeeded in securing Guadalcanal. As they pushed their way from island to island, the Navajo code talkers would continue playing a key role. Through the rest of 1943 and 1944, they found themselves on the front lines in New Britain, Bougainville, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, and Peleliu. Code talker Samuel Tom Holliday explained, quote, "They sent us wherever they needed us, wherever we were most dangerous." Challenges. Despite their success, challenges soon emerged. Firstly, there weren't enough trained Navajos to cover all units, meaning that coded communication between forces with and without code talkers remained impossible. Though this was improved by the recruitment of additional waves of Navajo men, the supply was unable to meet the demand. A further issue was that, since the Navajo Marines had trained at different times and in different locations, some variations in code usage developed. To maintain consistency, officers would occasionally exchange code talkers between divisions to ensure they all used a standardized code. What's more, despite the creation of specific military terminology, the limitations of the original Navajo vocabulary and the evolution of military operations meant that the code required continual refinement. Technological advances and new tactics necessitated new terms that hadn't been anticipated during initial training. To address these evolving needs, representatives from each Marine Division's Code Talker contingent met in Hawaii to discuss improvements to the code, incorporate new terms, and update their codebooks. These representatives then trained others who couldn't attend the meeting, ensuring that updates were disseminated throughout the Pacific Theater. Another challenge came from the risk posed to the code talkers in combat. Japanese forces often specifically targeted communication personnel, recognizing the critical importance of disrupting enemy coordination. Code talkers had to move constantly, sprinting from foxhole to crater while transmitting their messages to avoid detection by enemy soldiers tracking the radio signals. To do their job effectively, the code talkers also had to maintain their equipment in working order, which was not always easy when under intense fire. Roy Hawthorne would later recall one particularly tough combat patrol in which his unit found itself pinned down for several days. Quote, "During that time, probably maybe a few hours after our encounter with the enemy, the antenna of my backpack radio was destroyed, shut off, and I couldn't send any messages. So we needed to get a message out for reinforcements, or for an airstrike, or for an artillery strike, but we couldn't do it. The radio just wouldn't work without an antenna." Fortunately, code talkers were given training and equipment to deal with such situations. Hawthorne improvised a solution using the field wire and tools. He explained, quote, "With these, I was fortunate enough to repair the antenna where I could get a message out. I sent a message in the Navajo code, and in just a few minutes, a very short time, the Marine Corsairs came over and made the airstrike and saved the day for us." However, in the chaotic environment of the Pacific Islands, it was not just the enemy that the Navajo Marines had to worry about. Their physical appearance sometimes led other American soldiers to mistake them for Japanese infiltrators. Several were captured by their own side and nearly executed before their identity could be confirmed. The problem became so prevalent that some code talkers were assigned personal bodyguards whose primary duty was to protect them from friendly fire. According to Bill Toledo, a code talker from the second group after the original 29, these bodyguards had a secret secondary mission. If a code talker was at risk of being captured by enemy forces, the bodyguard was instructed to shoot him, rather than allow the code to be compromised. Fortunately, this extreme measure was never implemented. Winning the war. In February 1945, the Navajo code talkers would see one of their most significant deployments of all, the Battle of Iwo Jima. 6 Navajo code talkers were assigned to the Marines' 5th Division Signal Company. Working around the clock during the first 48 hours of the landing, these 6 men exchanged over 800 messages. The precise, rapid communication they provided was critical in coordinating the American forces as they fought to establish a beachhead and advance inland against fierce Japanese resistance. Artillery support, troop movements, and casualty evacuations all depended on the code talkers' ability to transmit accurate information quickly. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer during the battle, later stated, quote, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." This remarkable endorsement from a field commander demonstrated just how essential the code talkers had become to Marine operations. The other Marines came to treat them with extraordinary respect, recognizing that their unique skills were saving countless American lives. After Iwo Jima came the island of Okinawa, where once again the code talkers were thrust into the thick of the action. Famous American war correspondent Ernie Pyle reported how before the landings, the Navajo men of the 1st Division had performed a traditional ceremonial dance in which they asked their gods to make the enemy weak in battle. Whether the dance was responsible or not, by June 22nd, Okinawa was firmly in Allied hands. It would be the last major battle of World War II. The effectiveness of the Navajo Code was demonstrated by its unmatched security. While Japanese forces succeeded in breaking several other American codes, they never deciphered a single message sent using the Navajo system. The language's obscurity and complexity left Japanese intelligence completely stumped. After the war, American officials reported that Japanese cryptographers had made no progress at all in understanding the code used by the Navajo talkers. By the end of the war, it's estimated that somewhere between 375 and 420 Navajos had served as code talkers. They participated in every major Marine operation in the Pacific from mid-1943 until the Japanese surrender, sending thousands of messages that helped coordinate American forces across vast distances and contributed significantly to the Allied victory. Silence and recognition. When World War II ended in August 1945, the Navajo Code Talkers had earned their place in military history. But unlike many returning veterans, celebrated with parades and public recognition, they came home on buses without fanfare, returning quietly to their reservation. More remarkably, they returned with a burden few other veterans carried, a continued oath of secrecy about their wartime role. Upon their discharge, the Code Talkers were instructed never to reveal the nature of their service. The Navajo Code remained classified information, as military planners considered it a valuable asset that might be needed in future conflicts. This secrecy was so complete that even their families remained unaware of their unique contribution to the war effort. Parents, wives, and children knew only that their loved ones had served as Marines in the Pacific. Some Code Talkers, including Chester Nez and William D. Nyazi, continued to serve in the Marine Corps throughout the Korean War. However, the Navajo Code itself was not deployed in subsequent conflicts. Rumors of its use in Korea have never been confirmed by official sources. It wasn't until 1968, 23 years after the end of World War II, that the Navajo Code was finally declassified. Only then could these veterans speak about their wartime experiences and the innovative communication system they had helped create. Even then, the first significant acknowledgement occurred in 1982, when President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th Navajo Code Talkers Day. This date was chosen to commemorate the Japanese surrender announcement on August 14th, 1945. On December 21st, 2000, President Bill Clinton signed the Honoring the Code Talkers Act. This legislation authorized the issuance of congressional gold medals to the original 29 Navajo Code Talkers and silver medals to each person who later qualified as a Navajo Code Talker. As the story of the Navajo Code Talkers gradually became known, public interest grew. Books, documentaries, and the 2002 film Wind Talkers brought the story to broader audiences. Museums began to feature exhibits about the Code Talkers, and educational programs incorporated their history into curriculum. Former Code Talker and chairman of the Navajo Nation, Peter MacDonald, summed up the importance of their contribution, quote, "That code became a very valuable weapon, and not only saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but it also helped win the war in the Pacific."